Good afternoon to everybody who has joined us. Welcome to this month's webinar. We will go live with the webinar and kick off at 3 minutes past, just to give some people some time to get in. Now, get yourself a cup of tea and get ready to enjoy. Cool. So I have 3 minutes past on my clock. So just again, an extension of welcome to everybody. We are grateful to have you here on this month's webinar. To our newcomers, sit back, relax for the next hour. Give yourself a pat on the back for giving yourself an hour to learn a little bit more about raising the modern child. To our joiners who've joined us again, welcome back. It's always lovely to see the names repeated on month. Tracy Helps will be hosting our webinar today. She's a clinical social worker and a contractor to Nelson and Kaelo. So we are very grateful to have you here today, Trace, and taking us through this webinar today. We will be running some polls through the webinar. So if you're on your computer, they'll come on the right-hand side. And yeah, sit back and enjoy. Thanks, Trace.
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much, Danny, and thanks for having me again to speak to your most treasured clients. And I look forward to chatting to you and to everybody else on today's webinar. So hopefully we can be as relaxed and informal as possible, and I can take as many questions as people have and want to ask, and people can share their experiences, and we can really have an interactive conversation today. So all of that said, we're going to look at a couple key topics today. So we know that there is 1,000 topics we could talk about in terms of raising children and raising the modern child in particular. We could talk about sleep and discipline and all kinds of topics. So at some point we had to choose which we felt were perhaps the most pressing or the most relevant to the modern child in particular. So we're going to have a look at the climate in which our children currently find themselves, because it's a pretty challenging place to be in 2022. We're going to have a look at technology and some of the guidelines around managing that positively and not having it take over our lives. We're going to have a look at safety and how we instill a sense of that into our children. Look at some of the issues around stress, pressure, and scheduling, maybe some commentary on helicopter parenting, having a look at bullying, which unfortunately is a bit of a pandemic worldwide, but certainly in South Africa is a significant problem and challenge. And then lastly, one of the stalwarts and ever-present favorites, we're going to have a look at drug and alcohol experimentation and how we can manage that and perhaps support our children through navigating those choices. So those are the topics we're going to have a look at today. As I said just now, please feel free to interrupt, to ask the questions, to share your experiences. Let's be as interactive as we can be. Dani's going to be managing that chat box for me, so she will collect those questions and I will bounce off her every couple of minutes just to see what is happening there. Let's get going there by having a look at the current childhood climate. And I have kids, I have stepkids, I get it. By no means do I do it perfectly. A lot of what I'm going to tell you to do, I should be really trying myself. So this is really a no judgment environment. And I think the beginning statement or the first idea we need to accept is that most of us are doing the best that we can most of the time with what's available to us. And I think that most of us, most moms and dads and grannies and uncles and aunties, whoever you are that are raising children, I think most of us are really probably doing an okay job, especially given the challenges and the context in which we find ourselves. But some of those elements that are particularly relevant in terms of just understanding what our children are dealing with. And some of these are, and not limited to, the online culture that we currently have. My grandparents, your grandparents perhaps, didn't have to worry about keeping their children safe in person and online. Now, suddenly we have this whole online platform that is highly addictive, completely unpredictable, ever-changing, has all these developmental consequences. I'm going to have a look at those things in a minute when we talk about that specifically. But our children have access to a whole world that perhaps we didn't even have access to, or certainly we had access to less. And we don't necessarily understand all those platforms or appreciate the impact that it has on their neurology and their neurochemistry and their social lives. And they really have to navigate a whole nother plane of existence that we just quite simply didn't have to navigate. There is an excess of technology, and this is impacting their physical development, their social and emotional development, their use of language, their posture, their weight. Everything is being impacted by the excessive amounts of technology. But we understand this. When you've had a long day and you're exhausted and stressed and there's 1,000 demands and you've got to cook dinner and you've got to make sure kids' homework is done and all of these things are happening, it's really easy to put the TV on or to put a device in their hands when a kid's having a tantrum and you're in the pick and pay and you just want to get the shopping done because it's hot and you're tired or it's cold and your feet are sore and you just want it to be over. It's very easy to put a cell phone in their hands. So we all understand where that comes from, but it's having some significant consequences for all of us. And that's a big part of the current climate that children are being raised in. Often our kids are overscheduled. We are growing up, or they are growing up in a very competitive environment with very little support from the broader system. So there's kind of this belief that if you don't excel, you're going to be in real trouble. You have to do well. You got to win. You got to compete. You got to be able to do all these things. And kids are being pushed and shoved from one extramural to the next, to the next, to the next. And it's really resulting in a lot of unhelpful competition. And I'm not suggesting that every child should get a medal just for participating, but there is a level of unhealthy competition, genuine exhaustion with kids doing multiple extramurals on the same day, exam pressure, study groups, all of these things that children are expected to participate in. And it's quite simply at some point, it's just too much. They're overprotected. And I understand this. I'm a parent. In South Africa, we are compelled to keep our children very safe and very close, but it has a direct impact on their ability to grow and develop their independence and stretch themselves. If we can't let our children walk down to the corner shop or independently get to their friends' houses or, catch buses and taxis and these things, they can't grow and develop. They can't build that independence. They don't know that we trust them. They don't trust us to trust them. So even though we might feel we have to overprotect them, and we do have to overprotect them in many situations, it does have an impact on their ability to grow and stretch and become independent in particular. There's really an environment of excessive stress. And that's not just for the kids, that's for the parents too, or for the whoever's raising the family, the caregivers that are raising that child. There's a real environment of excessive stress. There's massive financial pressure. People are struggling to make ends meet. There's work pressure. People are working longer and harder, working from home and trying to juggle, kids at home and working from home. There's a lot of stress in households. And children are not immune to that. They pick it up. They feel their caregiver's stress, and they act out in response to it, which generates more stress. And again, we can't eliminate that stress, but we can really try and maybe start to manage it or manage its impact on our children. There's a great saying, our children don't want or need our stress. They just want our presence. And sometimes we've got to remind ourselves of that. And I'll say to my kids, we're going to be late, come on. And then I've got to go, hang on a second, that's my stress. I'm putting my stress onto them. I have to not do that. So we have to be mindful of the stress. And yes, we are under that kind of pressure, but ideally we should be buffering our children from that kind of pressure. And then no conversation is complete at the moment without at least noting the impact of COVID. And we might believe that it's coming to an end, that the crisis is hopefully perhaps over, but we haven't necessarily processed the impact that it's had on our kids in terms of their loss of extramurals. They haven't played sport, they haven't competed, they haven't won, they haven't lost. They've lost things like matric dances and final years of sport. They've lost time with their friends. They've all been stuck behind screens. They've lost the ability to spontaneously interact, communicate, and socialize. So it's had a significant impact on parents and families and on kids themselves. And I think we're still seeing some of the fallout from that. High levels of anxiety, lots of kids moving to a homeschooling environment or changing schools as families shift and change priorities. Families are downscaled financially in response to the current climate, and that's impacted children. So a lot of loss and change and shifting that children have had to go through and experience in the last 2.5 years or so. So it's a pretty tricky climate that kids find themselves in. And I'd love to ask you, and Danny will stick the poll up for me in that chat box. What do you think the current greatest challenge is to children? And when I say children, I really do mean anybody under the age of 18 years, and all the way through, I'm going to try and make it relevant to all the different age groups. But anybody who's still kind of at school, dependent on their parents, we would include in that childhood conversation. So what do you think the greatest challenge is to our youth right at this moment? I'm going to carry on while you go ahead and do that, but I will pause for a moment just to check in with Danny. Are there any questions or anything you would like to ask or perhaps add, Danny?
Yeah, definitely, Tracy. I want to add to the COVID impact. It's always interested me, how developing children are going to be impacted by COVID. Is it that because of the lack of exposure to normality, would that negatively affect them? In the same tone, there's been such a highlight on mental wellness within this COVID period that, would those kids actually come up better off because of that emphasis on the mental wellness? I'm curious to see, maybe 10 years from now when those developing children are developed, how that would impact it. Very curious to see that. If I look at the poll on the greatest challenges, top of the ranks is coming technology. So no surprise, that was one of your top assumptions as well. Second to that is stress. And I wonder how much of that is stress relayed by the parent onto those children. And then third, bullying. Bullying, the capacity to manage.
Thanks, Danny.
Yeah.
Thanks, Danny. And I'm equally intrigued by the long-term outcomes we're going to see in developing children from the COVID pandemic. And obviously we don't know yet, and only will we see that in years to come. But I think we're going to see, if I assume, and we can see how right I am in 10 years' time, we're probably going to see quite a mixed bag. We're going to see lots of kids with higher experiences of anxiety and some kind of maybe interpersonal problems. But I also think we're going to see kids with higher levels of resilience, a greater ability to adapt to change, kids that are more fluid, kids that are able to have the mental health conversation a whole lot easier than we've been able to in our lifetimes. So I think that there are going to be pros and cons. And I think one of the gifts of the COVID pandemic was that families really had to come together and spend a whole lot more time together. And that was also both positive and negative. It was very stressful, but there were also gifts and benefits in that. And I think some of that increased attachment and connection is going to really help children. And those that were able to have that experience, obviously be mindful that not all households, are the same, and some have greater challenges than others. But we're going to see a pretty mixed bag, I would imagine, in terms of the outcomes. And that's going to also be confused in terms of the consequences of the excess technology, because most kids spent a lot more time on tech through the COVID pandemic than they have and are now and have before. So we might find it difficult to understand what are the consequences of that excessive technology and what are the consequences of the COVID pandemic. But that's going to be some really interesting research to see in 10 years from now or so. Great, thanks, Danny. So let's have a look then at the hottest topic. And you're going to have to forgive me because I could literally carry on about this for days and weeks and months if I was left unsupervised. My personal view as a parent and as a social worker is that technology is really the demise of mental health, and particularly with children and with young people, but also with adults. And I think we all have to check ourselves in terms of our relationship to technology as well. There's a very clear and negative impact around tech. And I don't want to sound like someone who just demonizes technology. I think we have to have a positive and balanced relationship with it. But it's very easy for technology to overtake our lives as opposed to us using technology as a tool. There's a pretty fine line there, and people cross it a lot. And while we go through this, you can examine your own relationship to technology. Developmentally, there's a negative impact around tech. Even right at the beginning, children who are placed in front of devices don't crawl enough, which means they don't develop enough hand strength and enough back strength to be able to sit up in a classroom and write with a pen. So the teachers will tell you your child's development is delayed. There's no problem with your child. They just didn't properly go through all the required tasks of normal development. So, there's a consequence somewhere, almost everywhere. So kids aren't developing properly. They are losing the ability to thoroughly and properly communicate. They're losing nonverbal communication. They are seeing significant impact on their romantic relationships and dating when they start to become teenagers. And the consequences go on and on and on and on and on. And I won't bore you with all of them, but I would encourage you to do a Google search and just really come to understand the damage, the dire damage that it is doing to everybody, but especially to children. Remembering that children's brains are still very much developing and therefore far more vulnerable to being damaged than an adult brain might be. We know that technology interferes with sleep. Blue light that comes off of any screen, any device, erodes our melatonin, which makes it more difficult for us to get enough sleep and enough quality sleep. Very importantly, and this is a significant impact, it blocks creativity. And what parents are guilty of, and I've done it myself, so no judgment, is your kids are bored. They're driving you nuts. It's week 4 of the school holidays, and you are like, just play on the tablet or just go watch TV. But kids are meant to be bored. When we stop them being bored, we block their creativity. And you might think, well, that's okay. It means I don't have to clean up their fort and their baking mess and their, slime that they've made and whatever else. And there's a bit of a relief attached to that, right? But actually, when kids don't get bored and their creativity gets blocked, they don't learn how to use their imagination to create new ideas, to problem solve, to think outside the box, to entertain themselves. And we raise a generation of adults that have to be constantly entertained. And that's a problem, because kids who are constantly entertained by a screen can't focus in the classroom. They can't debate in a boardroom. They can't generate out-of-the-box solutions. So blocking creativity in a child has significant impact all the way through the rest of their life. Extra screen time equals extra couch time, which equals normally bad food, or extra food because we're eating mindlessly, which normally results in obesity and all the consequences that go with that. It makes learning a whole lot more difficult because no teacher in the world can be as entertaining as the bright lights and flashing gizmos on a screen, so our kids lose interest in the classroom. And any of you who've got smaller kids will probably have seen the epic fights in the car park when a parent tries to take a screen away from a child before school. And my kids' own school has sent out these begging appeals to not give kids phones in the car, because when they get to school, their brains are already wired to hunt for dopamine So they can't concentrate, they can't focus because their brains are hunting for dopamine. And nothing a teacher does can ever compete with a screen. So you've set them up for a day of inability to learn. They often have poor postures because they're hunched over their devices all the time, and we're seeing physical consequences like carpal tunnel because of excessive, texting. They're missing developmental milestones. Social skills are being radically impaired, especially when they become teenagers. And there's this connection between violence and technology. And this is a hot topic, I'm very aware. And my personal view is that I don't think a kid watching a violent video game or watching violent TV is going to make that child violent. But what it does do is it numbs us out to violence. It makes us tolerant of violence. It makes all of us tolerant of violence. And in our own lifetimes, you will have seen that movies have gotten more and more and more violent because otherwise we don't watch them. It doesn't register anymore because we've all numbed out to the intensity of violence. So that's a real problem. We should be horrified by violence. And remember that children are only able to differentiate reality and fantasy at around the age of 7, 8, 9. So when you let a child watch, 2 zombies on a screen or 2, My Little Ponies, whatever it is, being violent, in their minds, that's reality. They can't differentiate fantasy and reality. So that's real violence for them. So it doesn't matter if it's a cartoon, it's still experienced as violence. So we've really got to start to become particularly mindful about the impact of technology. There's lots of tips here. There's 2 screens of these, so I might leave you to read some of them on your own when you get the handout that will come after this webinar. But there's some very clear guidelines around technology. So the Pediatric Association in America is suggesting that no child under 24 months has any access to any screen at any time, including a TV. And that then from 18 to 24 months, it needs to be really, really high quality content and extremely limited. And the kids under 5 should have no more than 1 hour a day of high quality programming. So the content the kids are watching is far more important than on what device they're watching it. So phone, tablet, TV doesn't make a difference. A screen is a screen. The content of the programming is what is important. So you've really got to vet that. You've got to watch it and make sure that what you are pumping into your child's growing and developing brain is of value. We always want to prioritize unstructured play. If there's an opportunity for unstructured play with no devices, for kids to just play, with no teacher or no coach or no facilitator or no parent telling them how to play and what to do, to simply play. That is the healthiest and most beneficial thing that you can do for their development. We've got to have tech-free zones, in my view, especially meal times. There should be an absolute block for phones at meals, including the adults. And I just love those boxes or those bags that you can buy. Everyone puts their phones in and it blocks the signal. And for me, those are the best little contraptions in the world. You can extend that to when you're in the car. One of the most successful times to have a conversation with a teenager is in the car, because you don't have that eyeball-to-eyeball pressure of a face-to-face conversation. And often they will share far more about what's happening for them in a car. If they're on a device, you're losing that opportunity. So create tech-free times and tech-free zones in your home and in your life. With entertainment, get off the devices. Go outside. We have to work and do so much school on devices. Let's not also do our recreation on devices as well. Make sure there's limits to screen time. They should be clearly articulated. Even adults shouldn't have more than 2 hours a day of screen time. So we really need to wind that right back. And I'd love to hear in the chat box, and Danny can let me know how this goes. What do you think your average exposure to a screen is a day? I've been on my screen since 6 this morning, so I don't know how many hours that is. Someone can do the maths for me quickly, but I know that it's already way over 2 hours. At the end of the day, I'm probably going to watch some TV as well. Probably going to be on 12, 14 hours of technology today. It's insane. So how many hours are we spending a day behind a screen? Let me know what your figures are. Maybe invest in an app, or there's free downloads too, that controls the amount of access to a screen and turn it off after that amount of time has passed. And we have to lead by example. We have to go outside with our children. We can't be on the phone texting at home and scrolling through Pinterest and social media while telling our kids to get off their devices. We have to lead by example. And one of the worst things we can do is have that TV on in the background all the time. It's emitting blue light, it's making a noise, and everyone just kind of zones in and I call it dumbs out. They kind of climb into the screen and they're lost. Turn it off. Use devices for their purpose and then turn them off, so that you can create a family culture of limited technology. I warned you that these went on for a while. We've got to apply the same rules to our children's virtual environment as we do to their physical environment. And there's a speaker called Emma Sadlier, and if you have the opportunity to hear her speak, please take it. She does virtual, ironically, and in-person facilitations, and she is phenomenal. She's a cyber specialized attorney, and she speaks all over the place in South Africa. And the example that she gave, so I'm referencing her because it's a really good example. She says, you wouldn't allow your child of any age to walk into a massive warehouse, a picture like a macro-sized, humongous warehouse that's completely black. You can't see a single thing inside there. And in there are hundreds and thousands of human beings of all ages and cultures and religions and all kinds of safety issues and who knows what's in there and what they're there for and what they're doing there. Would you let your child walk into that warehouse by themselves and be like, good luck, I hope you meet really healthy people? Or would you supervise every inch of that experience? When we let our kids just go on the internet, we're sending them into that warehouse completely by themselves, unsupervised. They don't have a safety filter like we do as adults. They just don't have it. They haven't built it yet. Their frontal cortexes aren't designed yet to anticipate safety concerns. So we let them into this warehouse of madness and hope that they're safe. We can't do that. We have to monitor and teach them all the time how to keep themselves safe in a physical environment, but also in a virtual environment. Check the quality of the media they're exposed to. Preview, play yourself the games, go on the apps, be on the social media platforms. I'm not saying stalk your kid on TikTok, but you got to understand how TikTok works. You got to understand how Instagram works, how Facebook works, so that you speak the language, so that you can keep them safe. Otherwise, you become an ancient relic and they are very quickly outmaneuvering you. You've got to be on those platforms. Try and have platforms that you're interactive with your children on, so that you understand what they're doing, and encourage them to rather play a game that requires their participation than just staring at a screen. Because really, when they're staring at a screen, their intelligence is just leaking out of their brains. You want them to at least be participating with something. And the more meaningful and the more challenging that thing is, the better. Got to have those parental blocks, and I make some suggestions about the ones that you can use at the end of the presentation, and really just be there with your children, just like you would in a physical environment, and then process it with them. What did you see? What did that mean to you? And encourage them to think critically about what they've seen. My stepson is nearly 40, and he will come to me. He's a YouTube fanatic, and he'll come to me and he'll say, Tracy, Mars is purple. And I'll be like, I'm sure Mars isn't purple. And he'll be like, no, I saw it on YouTube. I'm like, Mars isn't purple unless it's changed and I've missed the research. And then I'll Google, is Mars purple? And Mars is not purple. And I'll go, my boy, you have to check. You've got to fact check. They just absorb everything as truth. It's absolute truth. So we have to teach them to think critically about what they're seeing on social media, on YouTube, even on the TV, on the news. Let them make up their own minds about its validity. And we have to teach them that. We have to help them with that. Okay, that's the end of my monologue on technology. Danny, are there any questions? Would you like to add any comments to children and our tech?
Yeah, definitely, Tracy. So, I mean, some questions that have come through, you have answered, but I just maybe want to emphasize what excessive screen time was the first major question that was asked a couple of times. And then at what age can a child be introduced to a screen time? And then last but not least, just maybe a bit more on the type of screen time. So I know you mentioned participation within the screen time is vital. So those are your tops.
Okay, so the guidelines coming from the pediatric associations is that no child under 18 months, so a year and a half, should have any access to any kind of tech at all, including a TV. And then from 18 to 2 years, you can have an extremely limited access to tech. From 2 years up, you're looking at about an hour a day. And from 18 years up, you're looking at about 2 hours a day. So we're normally significantly over that, nearly all of us, including our children. So those are the time guidelines. And then I think the other part of that question was what kinds of devices. So a screen is a screen. It doesn't matter if a kid's on TV, laptop, desktop, cell phone, gaming device, it doesn't matter. A screen is a screen. The more interactive, the more challenging the device or the game or whatever they're watching or doing is, the better. So if they're blindly watching garbage, again, I reference my stepson, he likes to watch people watching video games. It's the most absurd thing I've ever seen. That is mind-numbing content. It's giving him nothing. So you got to challenge the content. Rather than watch something with valuable content, they're either learning something or experiencing something, or they're engaged, they're playing a game, they're actively doing something. Then the screen time isn't dreadful. But those are the limits, those are the guidelines. I hope I answered those questions. So excessive screen time would really be anything more than an hour or two a day, which is, I know, quite scary.
Also very ironic from the chats when you asked how much screen time there is. I mean, the average answer was between 10 and 12 hours. So, and I'm mindful of the fact that a lot of us work on laptops. But I mean, how many of us are going home and then furthering that screen time?
Yes. So we used to say no more than 2 hours a day screen time, but we have to adapt to a virtual environment, right? So now people like me say, don't use excessive technology as recreation, because we can't get away from working on a screen. That's a fantasy, but we can manage what we do in our recreational time.
Definitely. I think, Tracy, the one question's now been repeated a couple of times. Do you know of any apps that parents can use to monitor what their kids are doing? I imagine you're going to touch on that at the end.
Yeah, so there's two references at the end. One is Parental and one is Bark. They are written at the end of the presentation. And they're particularly good because they flag trigger words. So if your kid has a conversation with anybody and your child or the other person says words like suicide, violence, gun, enough times, it will trigger an alert to a parent. Many of those apps entitle you or enable you to switch devices off remotely. So you can go, okay, you've had your 2 hours and you can disconnect the device from the Wi-Fi, perhaps. It also gives you back access. So your kid can't quickly delete whatever they were doing. You can literally go in through I don't understand how this works at all, but you can go in through the back, so to speak, and literally you are in their phone or in their device. So you have full sight of everything that is happening. So there's some great benefits, and every child should have some sort of, parental safety technology on their devices. Don't assume that your child won't. They will, and they will by accident. I mean, I was doing research, ironically, for a Kaelo presentation. It's a couple of years ago now, and I typed in something so general, like pink elephant or something. I can't remember what it was, but it was something pathetic like that. And I got taken to the most horrifying pornography website I've ever seen in my entire adult life. How I got there, I honestly don't know. But your child can very innocently type in a set of trigger words and access all kinds of things without even doing it on purpose. So we have to have those parental apps in place to keep children safe. Any more questions, Danny, or should I shift on?
So no more pressing questions, but somebody did mention an app called Family Link as another good app. It's actually got 2 good reviews. So there you are.
I don't know that one. I'll have a look at it. Thank you so much for sharing. Okay, so let me walk away from technology, because as you can probably tell, it's a pet soapbox moment for me, is to talk about technology and all its consequences. And I guess not too far away from that is keeping our kids safe. And I mentioned earlier that we've got to keep them safe in a physical environment, but also in a virtual environment. And at the same time, We need to not be maximizing their anxiety and making them scared of the world and of people. And there's a fine balance between, teaching our kids that every person is out to harm them or steal them or take them, and keeping themselves safe. There's a balance there. Some great tricks or suggestions around doing this, and these will apply to different ages, and I'll try and make that clear as I go, is teach your kids an emergency word. Especially your teenagers. As soon as they start going out independently of you, you want to give them an emergency word so that they can phone you and they can say, Mom, I really feel like watermelon for dinner. And watermelon is the safety word. They might not be able to phone you and say, Mom or Dad or Auntie, Uncle, I feel really unsafe. Please come and get me, because other adults might be standing there. So they have to have a way to get out without people hearing them do that. So have a safety word. Some families will simply say, message me an X. So you SMS me an X. Now, the second part of that is this is a no consequence escape plan. So when your teenage child does something really dumb and they get themselves stuck in an unsafe situation, perhaps suddenly there's drugs and alcohol there, or they're being pressurized into having sex, or people are getting violent, or whatever it is, they need to be able to say, I am not safe, come and get me. Like pink watermelon, and you get in your car, bus, taxi, train, and you go and get your child. No questions asked. They don't get in trouble. They don't get interrogated. They just get removed. You are teaching them how to get out of an unsafe situation. If they believe they're going to be in trouble for getting into a situation in the first place, they're not going to phone you. And they might not have the skills required to navigate that situation safely. It is our job, one of our fundamental jobs as parents, to keep our children safe until they are fully able to do that themselves. And that's probably well into their 20s. My stepdaughter is 23 nearly and still does spectacularly dumb stuff. So we still have a responsibility to keep her safe until she's a proper adult and she's adulting all the way. So have a safety word and have a no consequence escape plan. And don't ever interrogate them about how they got into the situation in the first place. You want to acknowledge that they got themselves out in a safe and responsible way. Teach them boundaries. Teach them from the minute they can talk that this is their body and that people need permission to touch it, to take it places, to do anything with it. And if I don't give you permission, anything after that is a violation. So teach them that this is my physical space, my physical boundaries, my boundaries on technology, my boundaries around my bedroom, and you don't get to violate that without permission. Teach them to keep themselves safe. Now, we can keep our little children safe. 2, 3, 4. As soon as they're 6, 7, they're not holding your hand all the time in the car park. They are making friends with people and maybe going to play dates at their houses. I'm not with my children 24 hours a day. Right now, they're at school. I have to teach them how to keep themselves safe, how to know what is okay and what isn't okay. And those conversations, in my view, should start immediately. And you don't have to go into the nitty-gritty detail and the horror of it at all. You can have conversations like, if something feels like it isn't okay, it probably isn't okay. You can tell me everything. You will never get into trouble. You will never get into trouble for telling me something. You need to learn to trust your gut. If you feel unsafe, you probably are unsafe. If you don't like an adult, if an adult feels unsafe, remove yourself. So teach them the same way as we teach them how to look left and right when they cross the road. We are teaching them how to keep themselves safe crossing a road. We have to do that in every environment. One of the great ironies around stranger danger is that upwards of 80% of abuse happens from somebody that you let in the front door. So the idea that a stranger is going to violate your child is not impossible, but you've got an 80% chance that it's going to be somebody in your household or somebody that you regularly allow into your household. So stranger danger is a concern, yes, but beyond that, children need to learn to talk. If you give your kids anything at all, you teach them to talk, to tell, to rat people out. This Umi did this and that auntie did the next thing, and we need to teach them to talk and to be able to talk about anything: sex, drugs, alcohol, rock and roll, politics, doesn't matter what it is, they need to be able to talk about it. There must be no taboo. Because as soon as we do that, they won't talk to you because they feel embarrassed or ashamed or like they've been naughty. And as soon as they aren't telling us, we can't keep them safe anymore. We have to know their friends. We have to know their friends' parents. Don't let your child into someone else's house unless you've met the parents. You've had a cup of coffee with the parents and you've got a sense of who these people are. Don't expose your kids to the news. It's trauma and horror and anxiety that they just don't need. So they don't need to listen to the news on the way to school. And there's specific research around children who arrive at school anxious and experience separation anxiety because they've just listened to 25 minutes of crime and violence on the way to school. So don't expose them to the news. Take that car ride as an opportunity to play a game, have a conversation, listen to the music, but don't listen to the news. Again, around technology, you want to teach your kids to really be selective around what they share, where they're sharing it, how they're sharing it. Teach them that safety. And never allow children to use apps that allow other people to immediately delete posts or to post anonymously. Because there's no legal recourse, and there's no accountability. If someone is stalking your child or grooming your child and can delete it, they can never show you. There's no evidence of it. So don't allow apps that allow for that to happen. Teach your kids to talk and make it a parenting priority to teach them to keep themselves safe. And that's happening from, in my view, from the minute that they can talk and walk, you are starting to teach them how to keep themselves safe. The same way as you teach them not to put their hands on the stove or not to put their finger in the plug. It's the same kind of concept, just in a psychosocial space. Danny, any questions or comments on that one?
Hi, Trace. Yeah, we had one very interesting one, and it leads back to trust us, I suppose. Does one hope that when teaching these kids these escape plans, that they'll learn that it's wrong by themselves before they get into that situation, or when they get into that situation? Will they then self-learn that it's wrong?
Yes. I mean, if they've asked you to remove them from the situation, they've already identified that it's wrong. So I'll give you an example from my own life. So I was a very competitive swimmer, and I swam kind of A-team from when I was in standard 6 or grade 8, whatever that is now, and was obviously invited to the first team swimming parties as a part of the team, but most of the swimmers were grade 11s and 12s, so significantly older than those of us that were in grade 8 were. And one particular party, I was in grade 8, they were all in grade 12, or most of them, and we're at this party, and it's the end of season school sanctioned swimming party. It's a perfectly reasonable place to be. And out came the cocaine. And I was like, okay, this is not something that I want to be around at all. And I gave it a little time. People started to use it. It got a little squirrely. And I remember in those days, there were no cell phones. So I went to the landline. I phoned my mother and I said, Mommy needs to come and get me. I don't want to be here anymore. And to this day, she's never asked me why, because we had that exact rule. You phone me and I'll come and get you. It doesn't matter where you are, what time of day you are, how far I have to drive. I will never ask you a question. And I knew that was wrong. I didn't want to be there. But it wasn't my fault. I didn't make any choices that landed me there. It just went like that. So kids will know, if they're reaching out, they already know that it's not okay. But if they got themselves willingly into a situation that they then can't handle, and that often happens for kids, they think they're big enough and old enough and smart enough, but they're just not. And they get themselves in over their heads. Then yes, there's a self-learning that, okay, perhaps this is big people's play and I'm not ready to be here yet. So yes, they will learn. And it does give opportunity for conversation. You can say to them, if you'd ever like to talk about this, I'm available for it. If you want to process what happened, then let's chat about it. So you're giving them space to learn, but safety first. Even if they don't learn anything from it, you want them safe in that moment. Hope I answered that.
Definitely. Yeah, you did. I think that's where the line of responsibility of a parent lies, is actually educating your child in what is wrong and what is right. And then they will themselves know in those situations, okay, so this is what mom or dad said was wrong or right. All right. Code red. Let's get out. Then we have another topic, another question on the topic of allowing them to listen to the news. What age are you referring to about not being allowed to listen to the news? The general knowledge questions at school generally are around the news. So what age do you sort of cut the line there? And where do you cut the line there?
Well, personally, I don't think adults should listen to the news either. So, I mean, I think that the news is presented in a sensational and horrifying way in order to grab our attention and appease the advertisers. So, I mean, it's the way that it's presented. If your kids are learning about Europe and trying to understand the Ukrainian-Russian conflict, there's a way to have that conversation, to Google the information and to present it in a not sensational, realistic, grounded way that's not just about horror and violence. So my problem, or our problem as a mental health community with the news, is that it's presented to be horrifying, especially the visual news. And social media news or misnews, it's presented to be horrifying. So if you want your children, or they need to, if they're older and they're exploring that content academically, then you're going to want to really check how that content is explained. So my children and I have had the conversation about the Ukrainian-Russian conflict. They understand why we believe Russia's invading, and they understand all the so-called nuances of it, supposedly, hopefully. But they haven't seen any of the explosions and the dead bodies and the mutilated dogs and the starving children. They haven't seen the images. There's no requirement for any of us to see those images. We're not designed as human beings to carry the weight of the world. I can't lie awake at night and worry about the Ukraine. It serves me nothing, nor does it serve the Ukraine. So we have to be selective about what trauma. It's genuine trauma. It's vicarious trauma. It has a diagnosis. We have to be very selective about what trauma we allow into our space, into our children's spaces, remembering that their brains are far more vulnerable than ours. We are numbed out already. They are not. I hope that answers that question as well.
Definitely. So I'm hearing to filter the news as per age appropriate.
Turn it off.
Okay, perfect. Thanks, Trace.
Okay, let's have a look at stress and pressure and schedules. And we can't get away from this. I mean, my kids have got a more insane schedule than I do. You know, it's swimming and it's dancing and gymnastics and it's birthday parties and it's all of these things, and they're all really cool and really lekker and it's a lot of fun and we'd love to do them. But there's a limit. Kids get tired. Kids need to be bored. Kids need to play unstructured without an adult giving them instructions. And I just love that quote that you can see there in red. And I have no idea who said it, but it's not me. So I just need to reference it. It comes from somebody else. Kids no longer go outside and hit a baseball. They have a game with a coach and school. They no longer sit in color. They go to an art class. And what are we doing to our kids' creativity and spontaneity and freedom? And we're not allowing them to discover their own zone of genius and their own interests. We're directing them and controlling them and trying to maximize their skills. Like, just let them play. Let them go outside and kick a ball about and like throw some mud and scribble something. Like, that is far more beneficial to all of us than this constantly structured activity. So I am all for extramurals, gymnastics, swimming, dancing, walking, running, soccer, netball. I think it's fantastic and kids should be doing it. But there is a limit. Not everything should be a competition. Sometimes we need to do something just because it's fun. And often I think we focus our energy on the wrong thing with our kids. Rather than focusing on academics and sporting achievements and cultural achievements, maybe we should focus on teaching them how to manage their stress so they can be well for their lives. Teaching them how to be kind in a really angry and aggressive world. Teaching them how to prioritize their well-being so they don't end up burnt out when they're 25 years old. Teaching them how to prioritize things and spend money and save money. Aren't some of those lessons or values far more important than who came first in the swimming gala? So I think sometimes our focus is on the wrong place and we nurture the wrong things. And then we end up with adults that can't self-regulate, can't find the middle, can't balance things out, can't do things in moderation, are angry and aggressive and stressed out and hyper-competitive. But we raised them like that. So yes, let them play netball and run and swim and play soccer and do gymnastics, all those things, but balance that out with downtime, with rest, with unstructured play and spontaneous fun and nonsense. When your kids reflect on their childhoods when they're adults, they're not going to remember the fact that they did dancing and swimming and netball on the same day and their mothers or fathers drove them around or paid for that. They're going to remember that awesome holiday on the beach where you all sat and ate an ice cream in the sun and then played in the freezing cold ocean in Cape Town. They're going to remember that. So put your focus on the right stuff and just take a little bit of pressure off. And that diagram you can see there is such a wonderful breathing exercise for kids, but for adults, I use it for myself. And I hope you can see my hand. Danny, can you see my hand nicely?
Yes.
So I can't see myself, so I have to check in. All you do is you take your finger, not a pen, and you just trace your hand. So you trace up and you breathe in and you breathe out. And you breathe in. And it's a great way for kids to visualize the breathing, and at any point in time, at school, they can do it quickly on their desks, they can do it in a car, they can do it on the side of a sports field. It's a great tool for them to have just to regulate some of that stress and pressure that they also feel, but don't necessarily have the words to articulate. And it's our job, just like it's our job to keep them safe, it's also our job to teach them how to manage stress. And I think it's a fundamental primary responsibility of parenthood, along with safety. I think it's a primary responsibility to teach our kids how to look after themselves, how to manage their stress and their wellness as a priority. Because I spend my entire life trying to help adults that don't know how to do that. So we really have to teach our kids to do that. So people like me don't have jobs in 20 years' time. Okay, I'm mindful of time, Danny. I'm talking too much. Are there any questions on that one, stress and pressure?
So I don't know if it would relate directly to stress and pressure, but very relevant question. So a lady mentioned my 16-year-old came home drunk from a party. He called me at 8 o'clock to please come and collect him from the party. And so we also have the rule of exit safety and to call me at any time, but I can't help but be upset at the other parents whose home he was at that didn't supervise the children well enough. How do I manage this?
So I don't know if your agreement is that it's a no consequence exit, but I certainly wouldn't apply a consequence. I think that kids are going to experiment. So the South African stat is that 8 out of 10 matriculants will experiment with an illegal narcotic before they matriculate. So the fact that he or she's come home drunk is a part of adolescence development. I wouldn't freak out about it, but I would use it as an opportunity to educate. When you drink too much, you render yourself unsafe in these ways. The risk of addiction or alcoholism is 1, 2, 3. I would have a very open and honest conversation, not a lecture, a conversation about the realities. And I would use other sources. I would use Google or movies or books to go, this is what happens when you drink too much, or when you get lost in that space, when you're in an unsafe place. This is what happens. And it's not your child's fault that the parents failed to protect appropriately, but you can use it as an example to say, the world around you isn't always going to keep you safe. You have to keep you safe. How are you going to do that? So either if you are going to drink, you're not going to drink to the point of intoxication, or one of your friends is always going to stay sober, or you're going to drink at home where you are safe in your own home. You're not going to drink very little. You're going to drink when you're older. Like, how are you going to do it in a safe and responsible way? They're going to drink. Many of them are even going to take narcotics. So how you got to teach them to keep themselves safe within that reality. The other parents, I mean, I had parents say to me once, and the husband or the dad was a doctor, and they said to me, but we allow the kids to drink and use cocaine at home so that at least they're under our own roof. I was like, I'm not sure the other parents are going to see it quite the same way. So yes, other parents do radical things. We have to teach our kids to keep themselves safe within that crazy context. Hope I answered that question.
Totally. And I think also having that conversation, that non-consequential conversation with the child further builds that trust.
Yes.
You know, so not only are you educating them about that, but actually they're going to learn that I can actually talk to my mom about this. I can come home and say, this is what happened at this party. Can you believe it? You know, so they'll have an understanding and build further your relationship with that child. Definitely.
Every opportunity from the minute they can talk should be you nurturing their ability to tell you anything. And I'm talking about the nitty-gritty, gory details that you really don't want to hear. Like when they start having sex, you want them to tell you about that. Even though you don't really want to hear it, you want them to tell you about it. So you've got to use the words. You've got to have the really open conversation, as squirrely as that might make you feel. You just got to do it so that they feel like there'll be no judgment and no consequence, and they are safe. Because as soon as they stop talking to you, they're not safe anymore. Okay, and in the interest of time, I might just whisk through the next two and then hang around for questions after that, if that's okay. So bullying is a big problem. In South Africa, it's a significantly big problem. More than half of South African kids have experienced bullying. And Danny's going to put up a poll in that chat box to see how many of your children have, or children around you perhaps, have experienced bullying. And we'll see what numbers we get out of this group. To be mindful of different kinds of bullying is really important. We tend to think about just physical bullying, pushing, kicking, biting, scratching on the playground, but it's more than that. It's the verbal bullying, the social bullying, which is often around exclusion or spreading rumors and gossip, and the cyber bullying. Again, such a powerful platform. You have to check into your kids' WhatsApp groups. Sometimes the language and the name calling is just vicious and violent and hurtful and awful. And cyberbullying is a very real thing and perhaps one of the biggest current problems. So be mindful of the different kinds of bullying because it is happening across all different kinds of platforms. Having a quick look at drugs and alcohol in 2022. So we know they are much more accessible than they ever were before. Physically accessible, I can buy drugs really, really easily, and they're more socially acceptable. People use them, they do them. It's not a massive taboo for someone to access them. Your new gateway drugs are things like vapes. People go, oh, it's okay, my kid's vaping, it's not a cigarette. But nicotine is the gateway. I've worked with addicts for 25 years. I can count on my hands the number of them that didn't start with a cigarette. Cigarettes and alcohol put you in a permissive group. So you want to watch their alcohol and their cigarettes because that's the gateway. Never mind marijuana. Marijuana is your third gateway. So watch those because it's putting them in a permissive mindset and in a permissive community. Drugs are also far more toxic than they were a long time ago. So kids could experiment in the 70s. They could have a drag of a joint and nothing catastrophic ever happened. Now, a couple lines of crystal meth or something like that can have dire and catastrophic consequences. So drugs are far more toxic than they have been in previous generations. You have a responsibility to educate yourself about kinds of drugs and the difference between use and abuse. If a kid goes out and drinks once or twice and experiences some consequences and kind of experiments with that, they're using it. If it becomes a regular thing, if it becomes a secret, if they're a bit out of control, they're abusing it. And that's a real problem. If they're using it to engage socially, to interact, to relax, to have fun, they're abusing it. We have to role model our use of substances. If I come home every day and I go, oh, I'm so stressed, give me a gin and tonic, I am teaching my children that when I feel stressed, I must drink. If every time you have a tiny headache, you go, here, take 2 microdol, I'm teaching them that any emotional or physical discomfort must be medicated. Rather teach them to reach out and talk. I feel angry, I feel sad, I feel bored, I feel lonely. Teach them a feeling dialogue, a narrative, a vocab, so that they can express those feelings and process them, not just medicate them. If kids are starting to abuse substances, deal with it. I had a family say to me once, my kid's using heroin, but I'm sure it's just a phase. I've never been so horrified in my whole life. It's not a phase. They are losing themselves in addiction. You have to help them get out. And just be mindful that it's 8 out of 10 kids. So it's not a case of my child would never. Rather say to yourself, why wouldn't it be my child? Why not my child? Rather than why would my child? Okay, look at the other way. Assume your child will, not that your child won't. Here are some of those references that I've mentioned already. I'm just very conscious of the time. So Nikki Bush is a phenomenal speaker, as is Emma Sadia. I would suggest you hunt them both out. The Social Dilemma explains very nicely the dopamine cycling that's happening in your brain and technology. 2 of the apps that I mentioned, and then a great bullying resource, especially specific to our South African context. So please go ahead and check out those resources. And then a reminder, as always, that Ask Nelson is available to you. If you want to take this conversation further, if you want to reach out in terms of any of the topics or just straight up parental coaching, we have that as a specialized service for you, for people around you, your dependents. Please remember to reach out to Ask Nelson. Let us help you take this conversation further. The contact details in case you need reminding, phone, email, go through that portal. So much information sitting there for you. Send an SMS, whatever's going to work best for you. And then I'm going to hand over to Danny. Thank you so much for your time and attention. I hope it was a little bit helpful. I'm very happy at the end to stick around for questions. I just want to wrap up so those of you that have to jump off can jump off. And then Danny and I can sit around and chat for a bit afterwards if anybody wants to chat with us. Thank you so much. Take care.
Thanks, Tracy. So in closing, you have a 53% yes response to the bullying. So very interesting stats coming out there and evidence of how true your words are.
Gosh, I forgot. Thanks, Danny. Yeah, the stat was 58 to 53. It's pretty close.
Yeah. So our next webinar talks to Rands and Cents, a guide to better budgeting. It's going to be hosted by Val Lemming. She is the owner and director of a financial wellness organization, Kaelo's financial wellness third-party provider. She's going to talk a little bit more about money personalities, the basics of personal budgeting, why budgets fail. She's going to teach you a little bit more of how to budget better, common budget blunders, and how you can make small differences to make big changes within your budgeting world and your financial world as a whole. If you want to register for the webinar, I have put in the chat where you can find the recording for this webinar. That exact same page on the Kaelo website is where you could register for the following webinar. Thank you to everybody who has joined this morning or this afternoon. We're very grateful to have you here with us. Have a marvelous rest of your June. Keep warm, stay safe, and keep well. Thanks. So, Tracy, maybe you want to touch on one of the questions in the chat box for anybody who stayed behind for the questions.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So,
go ahead, Danny.
Nicolene asked, my 4-year-old reported that another child was kicking him and saying that they are not his friend. He would cry when I drop him off at school. The school luckily looked into it and resolved the situation in the end. How do I, as a parent, help my child through bullying at such a young age?
Yes, I mean, that's a really tough thing for you to go through as a parent and for your child as well. And I'm sorry you had to experience that. And I'm glad the school responded, because that isn't always the case, and that they resolved it. I think in terms of supporting your child through that, and you'd have to do this obviously in an age-appropriate way, but the principle would be to help them understand that bullying has got nothing to do with them. It's about the bully, because when kids are bullied, they internalize that. They believe that they've been bullied because there's something wrong with them. Well, the reality is that a bully is bullying because they probably have a very damaged sense of self. They're probably going through some kind of trauma. There's a problem, whatever it might be. But our children internalize it, that they are not good enough, something wrong with them. So the first thing to do is to really teach your child in an age-appropriate way, obviously, that it's not their fault, that it's got nothing to do with them, actually. So it's not personal. It's not about them. And then to teach them as well that it's fundamentally not okay, that what happened to them. Sorry, I missed it. It was a boy, right?
Yes.
Sorry, thank you. What happened to him is not okay, and should never happen, and that it's a little bit of a trauma, and to really help them learn to trust again and learn to take a risk in building relationships again. At 4 years old, you'll have to see how much of that was actually internalized and how much of it is just, this kid was mean on the playground and now the kid's gone and it's okay. You'll have to see, the kind of impact that it's had. But if your child is still crying going to school, and you can let me know that in the chat box, if they're still crying going to school, you're really going to want to process it as a bit of a trauma and help your child to reestablish that sense of safety at school. So when something like that happens again, if it ever happens again, go to your teacher, ask to phone mom, remove yourself from the situation, teach them how to deal with the experience of bullying, because as we've seen, more than half of our kids will experience it. Teach them how to cope with it, teach them how to get help, teach them that it's not personal, it's got nothing to do with them, it's actually about the bully, and remind them that it's not okay, and then help them to reestablish that sense of safety in the world. I hope that was an answer.
Yeah, I think it delves down back to trusting and learning, having those conversations with your kids, those difficult conversations, which, as adults, we shy away from. And as adults, if we're shying away from it, how can we expect our children to come to it? And it not just with drugs or with bullying, but with sex and alcohol as well. Those difficult conversations, it's a parent's responsibility to break that generational pattern. Have that conversation with your child so that one day when they're a kid, not only do they better understand the situation, but they can then have those conversations with their kids as well.
Danny knows my husband, so she'll know what I'm about to describe, but he's the most sort of bullish, unfiltered, unboundarized, blunt human you will ever meet. And sometimes it can be quite shocking. But what it's resulted in his relationship with his children, so my 2 stepchildren and our 2 children, is that he is so open, especially with the oldest one, obviously, that when she decided to have sex for the first time, she phoned him and had a full conversation about how she was going to have sex. And I remember hearing this conversation and thinking, oh my gracious gosh, how are you having that conversation? But what it resulted in is her making absolutely reasoned, responsible, rational, thought out, processed choices and decisions. So it actually doesn't matter how squirrely you feel. You have to have the conversation. You have to use the words and have the conversation about everything: sex, bullying, drugs, teachers, boyfriends, girlfriends, sexual orientation, like all of it. You got to have the conversations and have them as soon as possible. So when you see something on TV or in the shopping center, you see a same-sex couple or you see a kid being mean to another kid, it's a chance for a conversation. Oh, look, see what's happening there. Let's talk about that. So that you're constantly talking about what's happening in the world. Definitely.
So Nicolene responded saying that her kid still is quite traumatized by the situation and still does go to school crying. So it leads to and maybe I should include the next question as well, because I think it's 2 in 1. My 13-year-old daughter has been bullied since grade 1. She's developed a low self-esteem and always apologizes for everything. She still allows for kids to push her around. And I told her she'd rather take a step back than be confrontational. Was this good advice to give her or not?
So again, that's a tricky question because, it can go one of 2 ways. So if you say to a child that's being bullied, I want you to stand up for yourself and push back, almost what you're doing is giving them permission to do exactly what the bully is doing. And we don't really want to do that. So there's a fine line between teaching someone to stand up for themselves and teaching them to be equally aggressive. I don't think teaching them to be equally aggressive is helpful because then the whole scenario just escalates. So the idea that you can turn around and punch a bully on the nose and that'll be the end of that, I think it works sometimes in the movies, but it doesn't really work because you're teaching the wrong way to resolve conflict. It doesn't help ultimately. What you want to do is teach them to get themselves out of the situation. So when the bullying starts, she's got to learn to remove herself, although that can be very difficult when your self-esteem is already damaged, because then you almost believe that this is how life is and that you are supposed to be on the receiving end of this horror. So especially because she's been bullied for so long. There's probably quite a lot of damage already to her self-esteem and her kind of sense of worth in the world. I would suggest probably some counseling at this point for her to reestablish that sense of worth and to learn where those boundaries are for herself. This is okay and that's not okay. And when you get to that line, I need to do something about it. That line for her, that boundary is broken and she's allowing things that shouldn't be allowed. She's got to reestablish that boundary. So whether you help her do that or a counselor helps her do that, or both would probably be the ideal, would be both. She's got to reestablish that line. This is okay, that's not okay. She has to learn how to get herself out of the scenario, ideally gracefully. And the new research, and maybe you want to show us some of this, there's lots of clips on YouTube. You'll find it quite easily. And it's really counterintuitive, but if you compliment a bully, so let's say someone is saying, oh, you know, you're so fat and you're so ugly and your nose doesn't fit your face. You know, someone's doing that. If you cry or you kind of shrink, you're empowering the bully. If you retaliate, you're escalating the situation. But if you go completely counterintuitive and you go, gosh, you look amazing today. Like, thank you for engaging with me. They have no idea what to do with that. And it nearly always ends the bullying. So it's difficult to do in the moment because it feels so counterintuitive, but it really works. And Google it. There's a lot of research in the bullying space around giving that kind of counterintuitive response and thanking or complimenting the bully. So have a look at that. Maybe it'll help. And maybe let some of the Ask Nelson child specialist counselors give your daughter some support.
Definitely. I think, Tracy, as a parent, you know, we could teach our kids to self-regulate, maybe understand, okay, so if somebody does make those harsh comments to me, what is happening inside of me? Am I hurt by this? Okay, so this is what hurt feels like. And then give them the confidence to understand that they can choose how to respond. That's completely within their control. And you know, teaching your child to do that only makes for a great adult. I think there's some adults who still don't know how to do that. So it's a great opportunity. It's always a learning opportunity in these things, in these sort of situations, to teach your child what is there to learn within this situation.
Absolutely. Thanks, Danny.
So it looks like our comments have concluded and our questions have concluded.
Great.
So thanks, Trace. I think I'm going to end the webinar. Thanks for your time.
Brilliant. Thanks so much.
Gracious response to all our questions.
No worries. I'll see you next time. I definitely need to come to Val's webinar. She's fantastic, and I have a bunch to learn in that space.
As do most adults. Bye.
Great.